Some men reach a point where money has answered every question they ever thought to ask it. And the one thing left that will not come when called is the belief that a decent person is still out there somewhere. Roland Danforth was 78. Half the office towers on the harbor side of Boston carried his name on the deed, and there were freighters going out past Deer Island with Danforth painted on the stack. And on the first afternoon of snow that year, he sat in his library with his eyes closed, breathing slow and heavy, pretending to sleep, so that he could catch somebody. $3,800 lay on the table by his hand, in an open envelope. Two of the bills eased out where the lamp would find them. He had run this exact afternoon 22 times in 21 years. 22 people had walked into that room alone. And 22 people had taken the money, and not one of them ever guessed that the frail old man in the chair was awake and counting. But the person who came through the door that day was not a grown man with debts. It was a boy of 7, in a coat too thin for the weather, his laces knotted twice around the ankle so his boots would stay on his feet. What that child did in the next 4 minutes broke something in Roland Danforth that had been holding its shape for 21 years, and it never went back. Stay with me to the end of this one, because 13 winters later, a single page in that old man's handwriting emptied the color out of every face in the room that carried his name. I've come to think a man doesn't turn hard the way we like to imagine it. Not in one bad night. Not from one betrayal, with a date you could circle. It happens the way frost gets into stone. A little water in a crack, one cold night, then another, and then a spring morning when the whole face of it comes away in your hand. Nobody is born like that. It gets taught to you slowly, and almost always by the people you would have died for. Roland Danforth had never once fallen asleep in that chair. His eyes stayed closed. His breathing stayed deep and regular. And his hands lay slack on the arms. And to anybody who put a head around that door, he was nothing but an old man who had gone under in the middle of the afternoon. Behind the eyelids he was wide awake, and sharp, and waiting. He had a private name for this. He called it taking a reading. Outside the tall windows, the first snow of the season came down over the garden. Inside, the fire had been lit at 2, and on the far wall, 3 generations of Danforth men looked out of their frames with the expressions of people who had never once been asked a question they could not answer. He had built the scene carefully, the way he built everything. The envelope was already open. Sealed would have looked like a test. $3,800 in hundreds. Enough to change a month for somebody, not so much that it looked planted. He had pulled 2 bills partway out with one finger and left them at an angle, the way money sits when a forgetful old man has counted it and been distracted halfway through. Then he sat down, put the blanket over his knees, and let his breath go long and slow. Down the hall, a latch came open. The man who came in was Travis Quillen, and he had been on the cleaning staff at that house for 3 weeks. He was 30, and he looked older. There were dark half-circles under his eyes that had nothing to do with the hour, and his hands had the split-look hands get in a Boston winter when a man is in and out of water all day. Roland knew who he was. He had read the file before he hired him. The way he read a file before he bought a building. Travis was a single father. His wife had died 2 years earlier. Rosalie, 31. Complications the second night after their second child came early. The baby did not live either. What she left behind was a stack of hospital paper the insurance had walked away from in 3 polite letters, and a boy named Jonah, 7 years old. That day was a Saturday, and Travis was not supposed to have anybody with him. The school on Prescott had closed after the storm, and he could not pay a sitter on what the house paid him, so he had gone to Odessa Hume, who had kept that household for 29 years, and asked, and heard himself begging a little, which he hated. She said yes. Then she said the rest of it. He sleeps in the library from about 3. If he wakes and there's a child in this house, the two of you will be down that driveway before dark, and I won't be able to do one thing about it. She did not say it unkindly. I'm not warning you off. I'm telling you the shape of the man. So the boy came in through the service door with his father and got the rule at the bottom of the back stairs. That corner, on the rug, you sit and you stay sat. Travis crouched so their faces were level. Don't touch anything. Not the books, not the table. Not what's on the table. Don't go near his chair. Okay. Mr. Danforth is asleep in there. If you wake him up, Daddy loses this job and tonight we don't have anywhere to sleep. Do you understand me? Yes, Daddy. Small voice. Not sulky. Frightened. And Roland, playing a sleeping old man 10 feet away, caught the sound of it and felt something snag in him that he had no category for. He had been braced for a child's voice. He had not been braced for that particular note in it. Front hall, 15 minutes. Travis put his hand on the back of the boy's head for a second, the way he did. I promise. The door closed. Now there were only 2 people left in that room, and one of them was pretending. There is a detail in what that father said to his son that I cannot walk past. He did not say, don't take anything. It never entered his head. In Travis Quillen's mind, his son was not the risk. His son had never once been the risk. What he was afraid of was the house. He was afraid of a world that had already made up its mind about men who come in the service door, and that needed nothing from him but an excuse. That is the distinction. And Roland Danforth, lying 8 feet away with his eyes shut, congratulating himself on his own cleverness, was not yet awake enough to hear it. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a child is trying to be silent in it. The fire ticked. Under it, very small, a boy breathing carefully. Roland waited for the noise. He knew what came next, because he had watched it come next his whole life. The boy would get bored, something would be touched and picked up and set down wrong, and somewhere in the middle of that, the child would find the envelope, because children find money the way water finds a low place. 4 minutes went by. Nothing. That surprised him enough that he nearly opened his eyes. Then he decided the boy was working himself up to it, which was better. It meant the child knew it was wrong, and knowing and doing it anyway settled the question about people more thoroughly. Then, fabric on fabric, the boy was on his feet. Every nerve in the old man came up at once. Footsteps started across the rug, slow, with a stop between each one. The walk of a child who has been told to make no noise and is taking the instruction more seriously than any adult in that house would have. They came to the side of his chair and stopped. Roland waited for the sound of paper. It did not come. What came instead was a hand, small and lighter than a hand ought to be, laid on the back of his own for about a second, and then taken away. He is checking whether I'm dead, Roland thought, and he pushed out a short, gravelly snore, the kind an old man makes, and waited to be left alone with the money. Then he heard a zipper. He could not place it. There was nothing in that room with a zipper on it. He heard cloth moving, and then a weight came down over his knees, light and faintly damp, and still warm from having been on somebody. It was the boy's coat. Jonah spread it out over the old man's legs. It went crooked, so he flattened it with 2 passes of his hand, carefully, the way a child smooths a bed he has been asked to make. And then he said something, so quietly it barely got past the sound of the snow on the glass. It's okay. I wasn't using it. Roland Danforth had rehearsed that afternoon 22 times, and he had never once rehearsed for that. His heart came off its rhythm for a beat, and then found it again, and he lay very still. Then paper moved on the table. And there it is, he thought, and something in him settled, almost with relief, because at least the world was going to behave itself. He cracked his left eye open the width of a thread. The boy was at the table with the envelope in both hands. He was thin. His hair had been cut at home by somebody doing their best, and his sweater had been through the wash so many times the cuffs had gone soft and colorless. And he was not putting the envelope in his pocket. He was moving it, sliding it back from the edge, in under the lamp, into the middle, where a thing cannot fall off. Then Jonah noticed the eyeglasses on the rug by the old man's foot, folded, exactly where a person getting up in the dark would put his weight straight through them. The boy crouched, picked them up, wiped both lenses on the inside of his sweater with enormous seriousness, and set them on the table next to the money. Then he went back to the corner and sat down and put his arms around his knees. He was shivering. He had given away the only warm thing he owned, to a stranger who had not asked for it. And he had done it with nobody watching, and no expectation on earth that anyone would ever find out. I want to stop here, because a 7-year-old had just settled something in that room that a very intelligent old man had been getting wrong for 21 years. We are careful about who we help. We check first. We work out whether the person in front of us has earned it, whether they will waste it, whether they will come back next week wanting more. And by the time we have finished checking, the moment has usually gone, and we get to feel responsible instead of feeling ashamed. That boy did not run a single one of those calculations. He did not price the man in the chair. He saw somebody cold, and he had something warm, and the distance between those two facts was the whole of his thinking. Children have not yet been taught all the reasons not to, and once in a while, standing in a room where the arithmetic has gone wrong for a long time, that not knowing turns out to be the most accurate instrument in the house. Before we go on, I'd like to know where you're listening from tonight. Your town, your state, the country if it's a long way off. Put it in the comments, because this story travels further than I ever expected to, and I like knowing how far. And if you're the kind of person who believes one small, unwitnessed thing can turn a whole life around, stay with me. Because in about a minute, that boy's father is going to come back through that door, and he is going to see his son's coat lying across his employer's knees. And everything that happens after depends on what he decides that means. Roland did not move. And while he lay there not moving, a winter he had spent 21 years refusing to look at came up out of the floor with the cold. Adele had been sick a long time before either of them said the word out loud. Roland, who had never canceled anything in his life, canceled everything, and sat in a chair by that bed for 9 days. On the 8th day, she asked about the children. Lowell was closing on a block in London. Griffin was on somebody's boat in the Caribbean, and the line was bad in a way that did not seem accidental. Marguerite had a thing that could not be moved, and said so in a tone daring him to make it an argument. "They're on the way," Roland told her. It was the only lie he ever told his wife. She looked at him a long moment and let it go, because she had known the answer before she asked, and asked anyway, the way you press a bruise. Near the end, she said the thing he could never afterward put down. "Don't let this turn you into something small, Roland." He said he wouldn't. Adele died at 4:10 in the morning, with his hand around hers, and no one else in the room. 3 days after the funeral, his eldest son telephoned him for the first time in 4 months. It was not about his mother. It was about the estate. It lasted 11 minutes, and Roland remembered thinking, even then, even that week, that it was a very well-organized call. I've kept promises I made cheaply, and broken ones I meant with everything I had, and I've stopped believing that says much about a man's character. What it says is that we make our promises at the worst possible moment for judging them, at a bedside, with our whole chest torn open, having no idea what the next 20 years intend to ask of us. Roland did not break that promise because of some defect in his character. He boarded up the house after the storm, the way you do, and then he never took the boards down. The rain stopped getting in. So did everything else. Travis came back at a run. He had done the front hall in 9 minutes instead of 15, and was pleased with himself about it. And then he came through the library door, and the pleasure went out of him the way heat goes out of a room. His son was on the rug in the corner, in his sweater with no coat on, and his arms around his knees. The coat was across the old man's legs, and on the table, 3 feet from a sleeping man's hand, sat an open envelope with money standing out of it. Travis had worked his whole life inside other people's buildings, and he knew exactly how thin the ice was under a man in his position. In 1 second, he assembled the picture the way this house would assemble it, and it was not a picture in which a child had been kind. Jonah. It came out low and wrong. He crossed the room, got the boy by the arm, and brought him up on his feet. What happened in here? Why is that on him? He was shivering. Did you go in that envelope? I moved it so it wouldn't fall off. Jonah. The boy stopped. And he looked up at his father with his face wide open and no understanding in it at all. And that was the part Travis carried for the rest of his life. His son did not know what he had done wrong, because his son had not done anything wrong. Travis lifted the coat off the old man's knees. His hands were shaking badly enough that he came near to putting the lamp over, and he stood there holding his son's coat crushed in both fists and whispered, "I'm sorry, sir," to a man he was certain could not hear him. And then the room changed on him. Don't let him grow up careful. Rosalie had said it in a corridor on the last afternoon she could talk for any length of time. She had used some of that afternoon on the insurance and some of it on where the boys' shoeboxes were, and then she had taken hold of his sleeve and spent everything she had left on this. He gives things away, she said, anything he's got, and every single person in your life is going to tell you to get that out of him, because it costs money, and you're going to be tired, and there'll be a night when you want to. She stopped for breath. Don't let him grow up careful. Promise me. He had promised. And now he stood in a rich man's library with the evidence in his fists, about to teach his son the exact lesson his mother had made him swear against. That kindness is something poor people cannot afford, and that the way you survive in a house like this one is to touch nothing, want nothing, and be nobody at all. There is a cruel arrangement here that I want to name because I don't think it gets said often enough. Poor families raise their children on 2 rules that contradict each other. Be good and don't be noticed. For years, the 2 of them ride along together without much trouble. Then comes an afternoon when the child obeys the first rule completely in a room where he was only ever supposed to obey the second. And the parent's blood goes cold, not because the child did wrong, but because being good has just made him visible in a house that has never once given his family the benefit of the doubt. Travis Quillen was not frightened of what his son had done. He was frightened of who got to decide what it meant. And in the chair, behind shut eyes, Roland Danforth was arriving at something he had never once considered in 22 attempts. The man standing over him was not afraid of being caught. He was afraid of being seen. And Roland had spent 50 years helping to build the world that made that a reasonable fear. He had not set a trap for thieves. He had set one for people who could not afford to be misunderstood. Roland made a noise in his throat, moved his shoulders, and let his eyes come open the way a man's eyes come open when he really has been asleep. Travis went rigid. He pulled his son back against his legs and took a step toward the door. "Mr. Danforth, sir, I'm sorry. The school's shut. There was nobody to leave him with. I'll take him out to the truck right now." The words came flat and fast, a speech built out of every other time a man like him had needed one. "Please don't let me go." Roland took his time looking at the pair of them. Then he looked at the table, at the envelope sitting exactly where a 7-year-old had pushed it so it would not fall on the floor, and at his own glasses folded beside it. "Boy." Jonah's face came out past his father's hip. "Come here." Travis's hands closed on his son's shoulders. "Sir, he didn't mean—" Jonah took his father's hands off him, gently, one and then the other, and walked across the rug by himself and stopped in front of the old man's knees. Roland leaned forward until there was less than a foot between their faces, and went looking for it. The flicker, the calculation, the small, ugly thing he had found in every human being he had ever troubled himself to look at closely. "You put your coat on me." "Yes, sir." "Why?" Roland's voice had nothing in it. "I'm a stranger to you. I'm a rich man. There are more coats upstairs in this house than there are children in your class. Why would you give me yours?" Jonah looked down at his boots, and then back up. "Because you were shivering, sir." "That's not a reason. My dad says when a person's cold, you put something on them." The boy said it the way you explain something everybody already knows. It doesn't matter who they are. Cold doesn't ask who you are. Roland Danforth did not move. "Who told you that?" "Nobody told me that." A small line came into the boy's forehead, as though the question itself did not quite work. "You were shivering." And somewhere back behind the old man's ribs, a thing that had been holding one shape for 21 years came out of that shape, and it hurt, in the specific way a joint hurts when somebody puts it back where it is supposed to sit. That sentence is not wisdom. I want to be careful about that, because we have a habit of dressing children up as little prophets, and it lets us off the hook. What the boy said was not profound. It was just true. And it was said by the only person in that room who had nothing at all writing on the answer. Roland had spent 21 years sorting the human race into people worth trusting and people to be watched. And a 7-year-old in a home haircut had walked straight through the middle of that filing system without noticing it was there. Not because he was wiser, because nobody had gotten to him yet. The test was not finished. The boy had cleared the first bar, which was honesty, and there was a second question under it, the one Roland had really been asking for 21 years. What does a man do to his child when the child costs him money? He straightened in the chair and let the irritation come back into his face. Before either of you goes anywhere, look there. Travis followed the finger. On the oxblood leather of the chair arm, where a wet coat had lain across it for a quarter of an hour, a dark patch had gone into the hide. Bridle leather, 80 years old. Water goes in and stays in, Roland said. It marks. It wants a man who does nothing else for a living, and that man charges $600. He watched the father, and only the father. What he wanted to see was where the number would land. whether a man with a hospital debt and no work past April would turn around and set $600 down on a 7-year-old. Travis looked at the mark for a long moment. "Take it out of my pay, sir." He said it quietly, and he did not look away. "All of it, until it's clear. I'll do the spring clean-out as well, on my own time, when it comes round. Then, I'd ask you not to say any more about it in front of him." Roland had been offered a great many things across a great many tables. Nobody had ever offered him 5 months of unpaid work, with one condition attached, and the condition was that a child not have to listen to it. He was not satisfied yet. He turned his head. "And you're the one who put it there. What do you say for yourself?" Jonah did not cry, and he did not look around at his father. He put his hand into the front pocket of his jeans and worked something out of it and held it out on his open palm. It was a bird. A tin wind-up songbird the size of a plum, painted yellow and green a very long time ago and worn down to the metal along the back where a thumb had gone over it 10,000 times. One wing was bent in against the body. There was a key in its side, and the key still turned, and when you turned it, the bird moved its head from side to side and made no sound at all. "I don't have $600, Jonah said, but I have this." "What is it?" "It was my mom's. It was hers when she was little." He turned it a bit in the lamplight, showing it, the way you show a thing to somebody who might not know what he is looking at. "It's supposed to sing. It doesn't anymore, but it still looks around." And then he reached past the envelope with the $3,800 in it and set the bird down on the table and stepped back. "Jonah," Travis's voice went on the second half of the name. "No, buddy, no." "It's okay, Dad." The boy did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the old man. "He's angry at you, and it happened because of me, and that's what I've got." A small pause. "Is that enough for it?" Roland Danforth reached out and picked the bird up. His hand was not steady. He turned it over once. On the underside, worn down almost flat, somebody had scratched 2 initials into the tin with a nail, badly, at a slant, in a kitchen somewhere, by a person who had never in her life been near an engraver. 3 feet away, under the lamp, sat $3,800 that this child had moved to safety and had not looked at twice. I have thought about that moment more than any other part of this, and I want to say why. It is not that the boy gave something up. People give things up all day long. It is that he gave up the only object in the world that could not be replaced for him, and he did it to settle a debt that was never real, for a man who had spent the afternoon lying to him. There is a difference between what we give and what it costs us, and almost nobody measures the second one. Roland Danforth had signed away sums that built wings onto hospitals. He had never once handed over a single thing that would leave a hole in him when it was gone. And so when he sat there with a bent tin bird in his palm, what he was actually holding, for the first time in 78 years, was the real price of something. "Yes," he said. His voice had gone somewhere else entirely. "Yes, that's enough." "Sit down," Roland said. Nobody moved. "Sit down." And then, much lower, "Please." Travis lowered himself onto the front edge of the sofa, the way a man sits when he is expecting to be back on his feet in a minute, and pulled his son onto his knee. Roland turned the bird over in his fingers and did not look at either of them. "The chair is not damaged," he said. "It's damp. It will be dry by supper, and there is no man who does nothing else for a living, and there was never going to be $600. Travis let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the doorway. and I have not been asleep. The breath stopped. Not this afternoon. Not any afternoon. 21 years I've sat in that chair with my eyes shut. I put that money out before you came upstairs, and I have done it 22 times with 22 people, and every one of them took it. He made himself lift his head. I set it out this morning for you. Travis's arms came in around his son. For me. Yes. You had me measured. Travis said it slowly, turning it over. You listened to me tell my kid not to touch anything in your house. You let me stand there scared of losing a job over a coat. And the whole time you were awake. Yes. I'm not going to thank you for that. His jaw was tight. I want the work, but I'm not going to thank you for it. No, Roland said. You shouldn't. It was the boy who broke it. He had been following the adults with a small crease between his eyebrows, and he had come up against the one piece of it that would not fit anywhere. You were only acting like you were cold? Jonah said. Roland opened his mouth and found he had nothing ready. But your hands were cold, though. The boy said it carefully, the way you correct a grown-up about something you are fairly sure of. I touched them. That part was real. And it was. The trap was invented. The cold was not. Roland had been cold in that chair every afternoon of every winter for years, and had put it down to being old, and a 7-year-old had crossed 12 feet of rug and found the only genuine thing in a room he had spent an hour arranging. I love this, and I want to be exact about why. Roland had built an elaborate machine for finding out the truth about other people, and it had worked perfectly 22 times. And it had never once told him a single thing about himself. The child was not clever. The child had no theory. He simply walked over and touched a man's hand and reported what was there. Which is, in the end, most of what any of us ever needed from anybody. That somebody come close enough to notice, and then say the true thing out loud instead of the polite one. Roland picked up the envelope and held it out. Travis did not take it. I'd rather work, sir. You will work. This is not charity, and I'll thank you not to insult me by calling it that. Roland pushed it an inch closer. I have been taught something this afternoon by a man on a cleaning wage and a boy in a home haircut, and I have never in my life had an education I didn't pay for. Get him a coat that fits. Get yourself boots that don't leak. Travis took it. It was the hardest thing he did all day. Now, Roland closed his hand around the bird. This stays here. It was offered against a debt, and I accepted it, and I don't hand back what I've accepted. He looked at Jonah, and something crossed his face that had not been there in a long time and was gone again quickly. But a bird that won't sing is no use to a man who sits alone in a room. So I'll want somebody to come and see about it. Jonah waited. After school, 3 days a week. You do your schoolwork at that table, and when you've finished, you tell me what you learned, out loud, because I have forgotten most of it, and I'd like to hear it from somebody who still believes it's worth knowing. He stopped. And I'll see to your schooling, all of it, as far as you care to take it. The boy looked around at his father. Travis had one hand over the lower half of his face. He nodded. Mr. Quillen, you're off the cleaning roster as of tonight. Mrs. Hume will draw you something proper in the morning. This house and the 2 on the shore. And you'll take the afternoons your son is here as hours worked, because I am not going to be the reason a man misses that. Travis put out his hand, and the old man took it. And then Roland Danforth bent down, slowly, because his back was 78 years old, and shook hands with a 7-year-old, as though they were closing on a building. Roland took the bird to a clockmaker on Bromfield Street. It took 5 weeks. The bellows had gone hard and had to be rebuilt out of new kidskin, and the bent wing had to be drawn straight and could not be painted over afterward. So Roland told him to lay it in gold and make no attempt whatever to match the rest. The man offered to take the scratches off the underside while he had it on the bench. Roland told him that if he touched the underside, he would not be paid. By the second winter, the library was not the same room. The curtains stayed open. There were drawings on the wall by the door. A house, a chimney with smoke coming out in a corkscrew, 3 stick figures of noticeably different heights. The trouble came in the third winter, when the boy was 10. 2 boys from his class came out on a Saturday, and one of them picked the bird up off the desk and turned it over and laughed. An old broken thing with a gold wing on it. And whose was it? And wasn't Jonah's dad the guy who used to do the floors here? Jonah laughed too. That was the part that stayed with him. He laughed. And when they had gone, he put the bird in the bottom of his closet under a stack of folded shirts. And for 8 days he was somebody his father did not recognize. At the end of that week, in the library, he said he wanted new things. All new. Nothing that had been anybody else's first. Roland did not raise his voice. He went to the desk and took the bird out and put it into the boy's hand and closed his fingers over it. "You gave this away once," he said, "to a man who had given you every reason to be afraid of him, because you thought he was cold. If you get rid of it, it isn't a piece of tin going out the door." Jonah cried for a long time, and the old man let him, and neither of them ever mentioned it to Travis. The bird was back on the desk the following afternoon. I want to say something about that, because we do not often say it out loud when we tell stories about kind children. A good child is not a finished person. Jonah was ashamed of his father for 8 days when he was 10 years old. And that is not a flaw in this story. That is the story. Because kindness is not a thing you are handed once at 7 and then own forever. It is a choice, and it comes back around and asks again, and it asks hardest on the days when it would be so much easier to be like everybody else in the room. What kept that boy who he was not his own character. It was one old man who had known him at his best and refused to let him forget it. That turned out to be Roland Danforth's real job. Not the money, the remembering. That was also the winter Odessa came in with 2 men to take the oxblood chair away and have it recovered. Because the mark had been sitting in the arm for 3 years, and she had run out of patience with it. "Leave the chair," Roland said. "It's a water stain, Mr. Danforth." "It is the $600 I lied about." He did not look up from what he was reading. The boy settled that. Leave it where he put it. Roland Danforth died in that chair on a Tuesday in January at 91, with the fire going and the room warm. Odessa found him in the morning. She said afterward that his glasses were folded on the table and the bird was in his lap. He had made 1 telephone call the night before. Jonah was 20 by then, in his 2nd year at school in Providence, and he picked up at about 9:15, and the old man did not say much, because the old man never had. He had wound the bird that evening for the first time in a while, and after 20 years of being carried in a boy's pocket, and a Hungarian's kidskin bellows, and a gold wing, it worked. "It sang tonight," Roland said. Then he said goodnight, and hung up, and went to sleep. They came together 11 days later in that same library, with the snow coming down over the garden the way it had the first afternoon. Lowell was 65 now, Griffin 62, Marguerite 58. They sat along one side of the room and looked at their watches, and twice before the reading started, Lowell said something quietly to his brother about the shore parcels and what they would bring if they were split. Perrin Locke, Roland's attorney for 26 years, took the pages out of his case. To his 3 children, he left the trusts funded in their names when they were born. Substantial, intact, untouched for 6 decades. And one line of his own, which Locke read exactly as written. Each of you has asked me about this document. Not one of you ever asked me about anything else. So I am giving you the thing you asked about. The three of them traded a look. It was not grief. Lowell already had a hand on his coat. "There is more," Locke said. They stopped. The remainder of the estate, this house, the shore properties, the holdings and securities, and all personal effects, he read it flat, goes to Jonah Quillen of Boston. Griffin came out of his chair. Lowell started in with influence and the janitor's kid. Marguerite had gone white and did not move at all. Jonah stood at the window in a suit that did not quite fit him and let it go over the top of him. Locke raised a hand and waited them out. Mr. Danforth expected this. He left a letter, and I am instructed to read it out. He opened the page. The handwriting had gotten bad in the last years, and Locke went slowly. To my children, and to anybody else who ends up in that room, you will be told that I was not in my right mind. 2 physicians examined me the day I signed. There is a recording. And there is a clause in here that costs you the trust if you contest it, which I did not put in to punish you. I put it in because I know how many years of your lives have gone into this piece of paper, and I wanted the paper finished. 13 years ago, I laid money out on a table to catch a thief, because I had decided long before that the world was full of them, and I wanted the pleasure of being right once more. A 7-year-old came in instead. He did not take it. He pushed it back from the edge so it would not fall, and picked my glasses up off the rug so I would not stand on them, and then took off his coat, the only one he had, and put it over my legs, and went and sat in the corner and shook with the cold, expecting nobody on this earth to ever know he had done it. Later that afternoon, I lied to his father about a damaged chair to see whether the man would take $600 out on his son. He offered me 5 months of unpaid work and asked one thing in return, that the boy not have to hear about it. And then the boy emptied his pocket and handed me the only object he owned that could not be replaced. I have written checks that changed the skyline of this city. I never once gave away a thing I would miss. That is the entire difference between us, and it turned out to be the only sum I ever got wrong. So the estate goes to the boy. It is not a gift, and it is not gratitude. It is the last bill I have outstanding, and it does not begin to cover the amount. Locke folded the letter. Marguerite stood up. Her voice came out thin and hard. "We are his blood." Jonah turned around, and there was no anger in his face, which was somehow worse. "Yes, ma'am, I know. I sat in this room with him 3 afternoons a week for 13 years, and he never once said a hard word about any of you. He just used to watch that door." Marguerite had nothing for that. She picked up her bag and went, and on the way out she passed the small table where Locke had set an open box, and something in it caught the lamp. Her step came apart for about half a second. Her hand lifted an inch off the strap of her bag, and stopped there, and went back down, and she walked out with her heels loud on the boards and did not turn her head. Half a second. It is not nothing. I have watched people spend 30 years in a position they took up in an afternoon, and the only evidence that a person is still in there is a hand that starts to move and then doesn't. I don't think Marguerite Danforth was a villain. I think she was a girl who had waited a long time for an afternoon that never came, and had eventually decided it was easier to want the money instead. Lowell was the last one out, and said they would file. Locke told him, without anything in his voice at all, about the 2 capacity examinations, and the recording, and the 7 witnesses, and the forfeiture clause, and suggested he be clear about what filing would cost him. They did not file. Locke put the box into Jonah's hands. Inside, on white silk, was the tin bird. new bellows, one wing in gold that nobody had made any attempt to match. And underneath, worn almost flat, two initials scratched into the metal by a girl with a nail, in a kitchen, a very long time ago. Jonah did not think about the house, or the holdings, or the number Locke had said out loud twice that afternoon. He thought about an old man with terrible handwriting working a long division problem with him at that table, slowly, because he had forgotten how and did not want to say so. The door opened and Travis came in from outside with the snow still on his shoulders. A single father who had raised that boy alone from the age of 5, in a rented half of a house, on what a man gets paid for keeping somebody else's floors clean. He put his arms around his son. He wasn't a hard man, Travis said. He was a cold one. And in 91 years, nobody ever walked over and checked. Jonah turned the key in the bird's side. It sang. 2 notes, a little thin, in an empty library. With the snow coming down over the garden, the way it had on the first afternoon. I'm not going to finish this with a lesson, because I don't think it needs one, and I don't think you need me to give it to you. I'd rather leave you with the picture. A grown man in a borrowed suit, standing in a room he now owns, winding up a broken toy that his mother held when she was small, and listening to it sing. Everything in that room came to him from a man who tried to catch him stealing. And none of it started with generosity. It started with a boy of 7 who saw somebody shivering and did not stop to work out whether he deserved it. So if there is somebody in your life who has gone quiet on you, somebody you'd decided was just getting old, or hard, or difficult, go and check. That is all. Go and check. You do not know what it is costing them to be cold.